Hello friends. Now we are going to study something more important and significant about John Milton. And this video is in continuation with the previous video. So we'll try to understand how he is taking life in his childhood and his public and political life, and how he is growing as a writer also. So let me just start, and we are quickly starting. Okay. This is all about his childhood and his impact on his reading and writing career. Milton was born in London on December 9, 1608, when his father, John Milton Sr., was disinherited by his Roman Catholic grandfather for turning Protestant. He moved to London and established himself successfully as a notary and moneylender who paid a great deal of attention to his son's education. Now, this is what the foundation which I understood, that his father turned Protestant, and that's why we are able to see this impact of Protestantism in his whole life, Milton's whole life. So his father turned as a notary and moneylender and paid a great deal of attention to his son's education. Milton is supposed to have led a rather pampered life at home. He studied at St. Paul's School, London, from some time between 1615 and 1620 till 1625. When he joined Christ College, Cambridge, at St. Paul's, he followed the regular curriculum of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But he also learned several modern languages from private tutor at home. Milton was known to have been an avid reader to the extent that it probably caused the blindness of his later years, and to have decided early in his life that he would be a poet and a humanist scholar. He went into Cambridge and received his Bachelor of Arts degree on March 1629. So remember this fact, in March 1629, he received his bachelor's degree from Cambridge, and subsequently his Masters of Arts in July 1632. Here was his nickname, the Lady, of his fineness of features. So this is one of the facts which we need to remember, that he was nicknamed as the Lady, because his features, facial features were very sharp. And this is in the Cambridge College. Okay, and in 1632 he received bachelor's degree. It's a master's degree, right? So he was nicknamed the Lady for his fineness of features. He was, by all accounts, a handsome youth who, by his own account, was thought his younger days drawn to life of the sensuality. But for worse, it is the pursuit of the higher ambition of becoming a poet. So after post-graduation, he was clear that he has to become an epic poet. The chaste lady of Mas Camus that he was soon to write, who refused to succumb to the temptation offered by Camus, appeared to embody these sentiments to some degree. There is some suggestions of conflict with his tutor at Cambridge, and of a degree of unpopularity which later gave way to respect and even reverence among both his peers and his professors, indicative of proud nature that was not given to bending to popular opinion. His Cambridge years displayed little love for scholastic logic. He preferred and celebrated instead the idea and literature of Renaissance humanism, blending a firmly rooted Christianity with Platonism. According to him, he was firstly taken up by the sensuality of Ovidian and other Roman poetry. You try to listen these videos again and again, and this will help you a lot. So according to him, he was first taken up by the sensuality of Ovidian and other Roman poetry, but later took greater interest in the idealism of Dante, Petrarch, and Edmund Spenser. This was to lead to a fascination with Platonic philosophy, and finally to the mysticism of the biblical book of relevance. During these years, he also honed his poetic craft in Latin, writing poetry that was highly sensuous in style. Two of his English poems survived from this period: On the Death of a Fair Infant and At a Vacation Exercise, both written in 1628. His first great poem in English, On the Morning of the Christ Nativity, which we will shortly examine in detail, was written in the Christmas seasons of 1629 and 230. It reflects the maturation to fullness of his poetical craft and its innate tendencies in religious theme, and it holds over form as well as a meter anticipating the work of his later days. El Eligero and El Penseroso, both written in 1631, although there is a question mark. Though less ambitious than the Nativity poems and more reflective in a pastoral vein, continue to reflect his mastery as well as we will be reading later on. So religious and religion and propaganda. On leaving Cambridge, it was assumed he would join the church, giving his scholarly and literary gift, but he rejected this outright, saying by his intention to become a poet and scholars and deprecating the tyranny of the church. This raised the problem of financial means, which is solved by staying with his parents, first at Hammersmith and then at Horton for 6 years until 1632. At Patrium, to father, to his expression simultaneously of gratitude of his father and a defense of the career he had chosen. During these 6 years, alongside writing Camus 1634 and Lycidas 1637, he was to also study intensely the Greek-Latin philosophy, Greek-Latin writers, and read extensively in the diverse disciplines like religion, politics, philosophy, geography, history, astronomy, mathematics, and music. A liberal scholarship that was unbelievable to him in Cambridge, and that he was to later deployed even in his poetry and subtlety and power. Camus was a mask that was first dramatized his favorite theme of the grand conflict between good and evil, while Lycidas, employing the form of classical pastoral elegy, may be seen as his first attempt to justify God's way to men. And that's what we see this theme in the Paradise Lost also. Justify God's ways to men. Following his mother's death in 1637 and later Milton's travel to Italy, winning some recognition for his early Latin poetry, he also visited the imprisoned astronomer Galileo Galilei. So it is by the time Galileo Galilei was imprisoned, and a meeting he considered significant enough to mention in the Aeropagitica. News of growing civil and political strife at home forced him to cut short his tour and return home the next year to settle in London and work as a tutor. Between 1641 and 1645, he was also to write various trenchantly argued texts on the church reform, divorce, and censorship that participated directly and passionately in the debate of the day. The picture that emerged by his time is that of the poet deeply engaged with the participating in the major issues of his day with a weighty erudition. In 1660, the culmination of the Civil War in England, Milton had written at least 18 major prose works defending the Puritan rebellion and attacking its enemies, including some support of Charles I. It was evidently a period when he suspended his poetic ambition to order to serve the thought, his prose and Puritan cause in the political upheavals of the time. The exceptions were the versification of a few psalms and writing of 17 sonnets, ranging in subject from deeply personal to political. All of Milton's prose work reflect a stern and ardent concern with the protection of individual freedom of speech and dignity. That's what you have to always remember, this thing, that he's always focusing on the individualism and the humanism. And reasoning and scientific approach is very much prominent in his writing, and condemned tyranny of any kind, whether by church or state. He repeatedly and insistently demanded the separation of religion from politics. So religion must be separated from politics. In that terms, it may be noted that high relevance to our own current Indian context, advocating a republicanism and almost heretical views of the Bible that were highly controversial and brought both suspicion and notoriety. His Aeropagitica, a speech for the liberty of unlicensed painting to the Parliament of England 1644, is a classic among his writing on these issues, as also in Doctrine of Discipline of Divorce 1643 and of Education 1644. So remember, these are the talking about women freedom, education and scientific approach. I again repeat, the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England 1644 is a classic among his writings on these issues, and also his Doctrine of and Discipline of Divorce 1643 and of Education 1644, and almost typical Renaissance humanist text on the ideal Christian education for young boys. The Divorce Tract was probably the result of his own disastrous marriage to Mary Powell in 1642. Mary, half his age, was the uneducated daughter of an Oxfordshire royalist squire who owned his father's money. The incompatibility was evident, and 6 weeks after the marriage, Mary went back to her family, refusing to return to Milton. For Milton, and marriage was obviously a tragic mistake, and he argued in Doctrine that the sole existing justification of divorce, adultery, was perhaps a lesser evil than a fundamental incompatibility that forced the maintenance of loveless union. So for marriage also he is saying that no matter what is there, the most significant thing is compatibility between two people. See, whatever the relation is there, caste, religion, age, or whatever may be there, but the most significant thing on the basis of marriage is continue is compatibility. If there is no compatibility, then your economy, status, your political career, nothing can work in your marriage. Mary and Milton were reunited in 1645 by friends. He went on to take in the entire Powell family of 10 members for almost a year, when they were impoverished by the Civil War. Before Mary died in 1652, Milton had 3 daughters by her. What is of consequence for us is that this strange union led to a highly controversial tract that developed on Milton's own personal crisis and presented it as a fundamental social issue, framing it in the discourse of oppressive laws of the church. But in doing so, he also opened the question of women's role in marriage, proposing an equality of relation and even possibility of female superiority. Even if he did not practice this in his own family, in relation to either his wife and his daughters, these opinions throw a great deal of useful light on figuring of Eve in Book 9 of Paradise Lost. Public and political life. Like when we are discussing the character of Eve in Paradise Lost, that time we can understand how he is advocating women's freedom, superiority, and even women are taking decision also. So now next is public and political life. In 1649, Milton had been invited by Cromwell to be Secretary of Foreign Languages to the Council of State. Though it was not a policy making position but rather a public relation one, in which he was expected to defend and support the government. Milton expected it eager for a more hand-on participation in the politics of his time. As part of this task, he wrote his first defense of regicide, iconoclast, on October 1649, and was to follow it with several others. The success of these was tempered by the realization of his failing eyesight, which turned to complete blindness by the end of 1652, which was also the same year his wife Mary died. Despite the blindness, he continued to write the political tracts of defense. He was employed to, several of them in Latin, addressing a European audience, although his duties were substantially reduced. In 1656, he married Catherine Woodcock, had a daughter by her, only to see them both die in 1658. He was also at this time working on the important treatise on Christian doctrine, finished sometime around 1659 to 60, and that offers May of the theological argument that were to form the core of the debate in Paradise Lost. Like most angelic of the time, Milton was raised in a Calvinist tradition and considered himself one for a long period. By the time of writing of Paradise Lost, however, he had begun to accept Arminian doctrine. which asserted the salvation of all believers. Unlike popular Calvinism, which pronounced the salvation for just a select few and strove continuously to reconcile this ideology of ideas of the freedom of the individual to rational choice. The figuring of Satan's Paradise Lost is a brilliant embodiment of the ideological tension of this position. Towards the end of his life, he had renounced affiliations to all Christian sects, claiming a theological independence that was quite radical for that time. So, these are how his personal life is also impacting his writing career. And then a restoration and after. So, this paragraph is going to be very significant. Please listen it carefully. The restoration of The restoration of 1660 was a deeply disillusioned moment for Milton, although his last political pamphlet written that year continued very courageously to argue for the Commonwealth form of government that he had to arduously supported and condemned the English people for being slavish. With the return of monarchy, Milton's life was in danger because he supported Cromwell. And now Cromwell is, again it's a restoration period is there. In this restoration period, King, the monarchy in the England has come back. So that's why his life is in danger. With the return of monarchy, Milton's life was in danger and he had to go into hiding for some months. The passage of the Act of Oblivion granting clemency to the support of the Commonwealth eventually made it safe for him to emerge. But even then, only with the support and intervention of friends like the poet Andrew Marvell and playwright William Devenant, and probably because his complete blindness suggested he was now completely harmless too. He lives the years from then till his death in straitened financial circumstances, and 1660 to 1665, Milton concentrated on further study with the aid of his third wife Elizabeth Munshale, whom he married in 1663, and his daughters, who also took the diction of his magnum opus Paradise Lost. It was published finally in 1667, and he followed in 1671 by the publication of Paradise Regained and Samson Agonist. Milton did not survive long after this, and already severely ill, he died on 8 November 1674. So he died on 8 November 1674. The restoration of 1660 was a deeply disillusioned moment for Milton, although his last political pamphlet written that year continued very courageously to argue the Commonwealth form of government that he had so ardently supported and condemned the English people for being slavish. But the return of monarchies, Milton's life was in danger and he had to go into hiding for some months. The passage of Act of Oblivion granting clemency to the supporters of the Commonwealth eventually made this safe for him to emerge. But even then, only with the supports of intervention of friends like poet Andrew Marvell and playwright William Devenant. So Andrew Marvell was his friend, and playwright William Devenant was also his friend who helped him during restoration, and probably because his complete blindness suggested he was now completely harmless too. He lives the year from then till his death in straight financial circumstances, and from 1660 to 1665 Milton concentrated on further study with the aid of his third wife Elizabeth Munshale, whom he married in 1663, and his daughters, who also took the dedication of his magnum opus Paradise Lost. It was published finally in 1667, to be followed in 1671 by publication of Paradise Regained and Samson Agonist. Milton did not survive the long after this, and already severely ill, he died on 8th November 1674. So this is what his after this during the time of restoration, what he was doing. Then how his political career grew. Milton is considered by many to be most important and influential poet in English language after William Shakespeare. He was to have a lasting impact on the work in particular of poets like William Wordsworth, Percy Shelley, William Butler Yeats. From this early precocity in learning and interest in poetry, it is evident that he was not only gifted but aware of his gift and willing to hone them through years of reading and writing. It is also clear that Milton's understanding of poetic vocation was from the very beginning as an exalted one. He saw himself as true successor of Spencer in that he wanted to fuse the classical inheritage of Renaissance with the Christian spirit of Reformation. So Renaissance, Renaissance, that is particularly in the classical heritage of Renaissance. Classical heritage of Renaissance, he wanted to mix with the spirit of Reformation, Christian spirit of Reformation. This you remember. While remaining a quite essentially English poet, it is in the sense that Milton is also an intensely self-reflexive poet whose poetry is stuffed with the awareness of his own ambition and vocation. When we examine some of the shorter poems, this sense of self-awareness in the poetry will become clear, but for immediate reference for the student, it may be worth looking at Milton's Lycidas, a poem in which the poet explicitly poses the question of the worth of poetry and of the poetic vocation. The important point to note is that the answer of Milton was always religious one, in the sense that he saw his poetry as always at the service of Christianity. In this sense, poetry was a spiritual vocation, divinely inspired by religious muse, and therefore in the continuation of this religious interest rather than a means of self-aggrandizement. However, it is also clear that Milton, the religious was not divorced from the political. This political sensibility manifests in several ways in his intense conviction in religious autonomy. So he actually wanted religious autonomy. Religion must be independent from politics. Must not be any mixing of religion and politics. His belief that one true of the rejoinder of classical literature and philosophy would have to be an elaborate Christian one, and in the concomitant a need to expose contemporary Protestant English culture as a true Christian one. The consequent was inevitably a strongly English nationalistic sensibility which he was working out in both humanist and Protestant religious terms in his poetry. In addition to strongly political dimension of his poetic work, almost all Milton's poetry is stuffed by the musicality that underscores his singing attention to enhancing the poetic life of English language specifically. So that's why we find a lot of rhymes, rhythm, and lot of lyrical skills explored in his writing. So that's how we can say. So these are significant points we are discussing, and this video is about 23 minutes, and I hope you will understand it. By the time, there are certain writers which he is mentioning, that is Cedric Brown, John Milton, Literary Life, which is published in 1995. Then Gordon Campbell, A Milton Chronology, New York, Macmillan, St. Martin's, 1997. Dennis Danielson, it is edited book, The Cambridge Companion to Milton, and Cambridge, England, Cambridge, 1989. Then Christopher Gross, Milton and the Sense of Tradition, Yale University, 1988. Then John Guillory, Milton, Narcissism, Gender, on the Genealogy of Male Self-Esteem, Critical Essays on John Milton, that is edited by Christopher Kendrick. And then Barbara Lewalski, The Life of John Milton, Oxford, Blackwell, 2000. Then David Lowenstein, Representing Revolution in Milton and His Contemporaries, Religion, Politics and Polemics in Radical Puritanism, Cambridge University Press, 2001. Then Lisa Law, Elaine Lisa Law and Anthony John Harding, edited book है Milton and Metaphysicals and Romanticism, Cambridge University Press, 1994. Then David Miller, John Milton, Poetry, It's Boston and publication in 1978. Then Stephen Orgel and Jonathan Goldberg, edited book, The Oxford Authors, John Milton, Oxford University Press, 1991. Then John Shawcross, T. John Shawcross, John Milton, The Self and the World. That is, it is University Press of Kentucky, 1993. And then Sigmund Spaeth, Milton's Knowledge of Music, and University of Michigan Press, 1963. Then Praise Zagruin, Milton, Aristocrat and Rebel, The Poet and His Politics, New York, D.S. Brewer, 1992. So these are the books and through which you can understand. And this is some significant introduction. This information we can share. That is, this information is significant. Please listen. What I'm trying to say. Any poetic career can show a wide variety of tendencies and inclinations. Milton is no exception. In the course of this, Milton's poetic and literary life can be broadly divided into 3 phases. That is, one is early phase. So we are dividing Milton's writing phase in 3 parts. First one is early phase of idealistic. In early phase he is idealistic, and then the second phase is political involvement, and the third phase is when he is blind and he is focusing on his writings. So these are, and this is the out of this third phase, out of these, the last 3 phase, third phase, we see the outcome of Paradise Lost is there. The date of Milton's decision to become a poet can't be determined with any accuracy, but the decision was probably taken early. The verse paraphrases of Psalm 114 and 136 are the earliest extant poetic piece. They are dated from his final year of St. Paul School. They already show the poetic promise that Milton was to fulfill in his later years. These 2 English paraphrases, the 4 epigram, 3 Latin, 1 and Greek, and have tentatively been dated in 1624, and only surviving pieces from the pre-Cambridge verse. In the subsequent undergraduate year, from 1625 to March 1629, at Cambridge, Milton wrote a lot of Latin poetry, which is not of any immediate relevance to our study. Only 2 English poems, that is 1628, on the death of fair infant, written after the death of his little niece in January 1628, and at a vacation exercise written in July or August of the same year. Let us briefly examine these 2 poems to get a sense of the kind of poetic temperament the early Milton displayed. We need not study them in any detail on these. So these are the early writings and how he's influenced by the Latin writing. This paragraph is going to be very, very significant. Please listen, and then you can get lot of information out of this. Okay, so let me start. From Milton's thought was Milton's thought was the Bible. And it is important, is evident directly or indirectly in almost all of his works. In the introduction, we found that Milton, the Bible was obviously much more than just a storehouse of narratives. It was in the fact that single most important explanation of the existence of humanity. It presents in his work, it thus much of the theological and its mythological content. Milton's even evokes the style and tone of Bible in his work, especially of the Old Testament, which he was particularly impressed. Biblical motifs and concerns are evident in his lesser poems as well as in the epic like Paradise Lost, and for instance his major work on the morning of the Christ nativity. So Bible is having a lot of impact on him, and Bible is not simply a storehouse of narratives, but it is much more than that. 17th century readers would have been intimately familiar with biblical theme like the Genesis story of the fall of man. fall of man. Okay, which Milton's pick up in Paradise Lost. Beside being part of the religious education, it has already received much attention by the earlier writers and poets. But we tend to forget that part of any school education in the 17th century was also reading in classical literature, including writers like Homer, Ovid, Virgil, Cicero, Longinus, and Horace. Allusions to whom would therefore be easily identifiable to Milton's contemporary reader. But Milton was also often deliberately eluded in his work, ostensibly displayed his mastery of Western learning and literature beyond that would be familiar to average 17th century reader. For if we add to the usual education of Milton's on voluminous studies in the classics and discipline like theology, philosophy, astronomy, history, though this within the Bible we find a monumental corpus of the writers and works that act and source of material for Milton's own writing. Milton drew on these for themes and ideas as much as for the models of style. Virgil, for instance, was the model for the epic as well as pastoral. Milton's used in poems like Lycidas and Cicero provide the model for almost all prose writers of the age. The Greek, Aristotle, and Latin Longinus would have offered Milton strong theories of Yana to negotiate his work. Likewise, Ovid's Metamorphoses provided Milton with many allegorical situations and ideas that we find strinking throughout his poetry. But Milton also familiar with the work of more recent 17th century poets like Bembo, Della Casa, and Tasso, from whom he may have derived the idea of writing an epic in his blank verse. Among English writers, Milton himself claimed Edmund Spenser as an important predecessor, while his sonnets suggest an influence of Shakespeare, whom is celebrated in his poetry. The influence of former of the Shepherd's Calendar is especially evident in Milton's more pastoral poem, while that of the latter may be founded in his kinship between Shakespeare and figures like Macbeth and Milton's own Satan. He has, however, as we have noted in the previous unit, that his common poetic fashions of his time he is using. So there are number of writers he has mentioned, and how these writers has made a lot of impact on his writing. And for that matter, I repeat again, that is how the Milton drew on these for the theme and ideas of the style. Virgil, for instance, was model for the epic as well as pastoral theme. Okay, so from Virgil he is getting this model for the epic and the pastoral theme. And then Cicero provided him the model for almost prose writers of the age. Aristotle and Latin Longinus would have offered Milton strong theories of Yana and to negotiate his work. Ovid's Metamorphoses provided him with the allegorical situation and ideas that we find throughout his poetry. So these writers of his time, they provided him so much of variety and a lot of influence. Okay, and that is why we are able to see him so powerful. While these sources and lines of influences are useful in understanding Milton's literary craft and its text, as well as in tracing point of continuity and originality in relation to the foreign tradition, they cannot explain Milton's unique poetic individuality. What is unique to Milton's poetic style is more than the simple aggregated of these sources and influence on his writing. As we noted earlier, perhaps the most remarkable quality of Milton's poetry is the importance of sound, rhythm, and music. Okay, so what is that? Sound, rhythm, and music. This is what important. And please remember, how the impact of Virgil is there. Impact of Virgil is there. Then Cicero is there, and then Aristotle and Longinus is there, and then finally Ovid is there. So these are the writer who influenced him too much, right? And how he's drawing. From Virgil, he's drawing a model for epic and pastoral. From Aristotle and Longinus, he would prefer strong theories of Yana and negotiate work. Ovid, Metamorphoses, and then finally Finally, we see Bembo, Della, Casa and Tasso. They also have made lot of impact on his blank verse writing. So these are the writers who influenced him, right? But while these sources and lines of influences was useful in understanding Milton's literary craft and its context, as well as in tracing points of continuity and originality in the relation to the longer tradition, explain Milton's unique poetic individuality, and that is his simple poetic individuality is music, rhythm and Milton's individuality. What is unique? Milton's poetic style is more than simple aggregated of the sources of influences on his writing. We noted earlier perhaps the most remarkable quality of Milton's poetry is his sound, rhythm and the music to fulfill the meaning. Quality and distinguishes his verse more than any other. Intensification in his later poetry may be partially explained by the fact that his blindness, but a definitive presence even in this work is indicative of the affinity in music and precede this condition, suggested that Milton's attempt to fill his writing with a more ephemeral effect of music. So that's what you remember. Music, sound, rhythm, music, and meaning to it. Sound, rhythm, music, and meaning to the words. That has led some critic to remark rather unkindly that while Shakespeare's voice is hardly ever evident in his own work, there is evidence of no other voice but his own, with his own, and one can identify music as a source and influence of Milton's work that remain less easily detectable, yet perhaps more important than it appears. So in this paragraph we studied writers like Virgil, Aristotle, Ovid and Longinus, how they impacted his writing and what genre or a style he's drawing out of these. Then sound, rhythm, music and meaning to the words is his specific quality. So that's how we can say that how Milton is writing significantly. So we are stopping here. These are the introductory lectures on Milton. You can find out, you listen these videos again, and by listening you will be able to recall minor facts which you might miss in the first listening. So listen it and then you will have a lot of impact on your writing. Thank you so much. Do not forget to subscribe my channel Dr. Anju Gurawa, because when you watch it, you write a comment. This actually gives me a lot of happiness, and actually I feel that okay, I'm doing something worth for my students. Thank you so much. Please subscribe, share and like the channel.